Did you know you can bake almost any bread from around the world using the ingredients found in your kitchen? Welcome to Summer Bakes the World. I'm Summer. Most countries have some sort of traditional bread in with every meal. For example, the baguette in France, tortilla in Mexico. Well, that's what this channel is all about. Baking bread from around the world, providing a little history and a plethora of tips. So join me, whether in my kitchen or yours, and together we can discover the world. Today, let's take a trip. Let's take a connectcation. Okay, so this is my cheesy way of saying, let's connect to the world from our kitchens. Let's take a connectation. So let's cross the big blue today and let's take a connectation to Japan. I don't know about you, but when I think of Japan, I think of noodles and rice, not a traditional bread. But did you know that Japan has a good traditional yeast bread known as the Hokkaido Japanese Milk Bread? And it uses a starter called a Tangzhong mixture. It starts out as a roux and that becomes a slurry for our bread. So first, let's get started with the core of the video, the ingredients. First, we have bread flour, also known as strong flour. We're using an active dry yeast, sugar, salt, milk, eggs, butter. So these are the basics from our kitchens, right? Yet, who knew we could taste Japan without leaving our homes? How cool is that? We're going to whisk together a 1/3 cup of bread flour, 1 cup of milk. Allow this to thicken slowly over low heat so that the milk does not burn. You can also heat up the milk in the microwave to quick start the heating process. Preheating the milk will reduce the overall time it takes on the stove to create the slurry. The Tangzhong mixture is an Asian technique. We can call it the Japanese secret, if you will. It's designed to provide a quick and easy path to tenderizing the dough, while you can use either milk or water mixed with flour and then heated. And once it's heated, it produces a nice gelatinous slurry that it's then cooled down to warm and then added to the dough. All right, so let's take a look. Our mixture is ready. Notice all of the trails that are left behind from the whisk. It's ready to go. Take it off the heat. We're gonna set it aside and let it cool for at least 10 minutes until it's closer to 100 to 110 degrees. You don't want it to be any warmer than 115 degrees. Too much heat will kill the yeast as we add it to the dough. Let's move to the dough base. So as with most yeasted breads, we're going to whisk some milk that's warm with some sugar and some yeast, and this will activate the yeast. So I've heated up 1 cup of milk plus 2 tablespoons. I heated up in the microwave until it reached between 100 and 110 degrees. You can also heat it over the stove. Just be careful not to overheat it or you'll need to let it cool down. So we've got 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons. To that, we're gonna add 4 teaspoons of yeast, add 6 tablespoons of sugar, and I am using cane sugar. Any kind of granulated sugar will be fine. Kind of mix it in really well. I'm gonna let this sit for about 10 minutes, and it's during that 10 minutes that the yeast will be activated. It will become pretty frothy and it will almost double in size. So let's move on with the rest of our ingredients. So the next thing you need is a mixing bowl. I'm using my KitchenAid mixer because it's great for mixing up your ingredients really well, for kneading. So sometimes I'll make bread and just use my mixer to knead the dough. Today we're gonna use it for mixing, and I'm also gonna knead by hand. But if you have just a regular mixing bowl, that's all you need. And then you can just use the tools that God gave you and mix up your ingredients yourself. Okay, so first we're gonna need a total of 5½ cups of flour, and remember this is bread flour. And I have 5 in here right now, so I'm gonna add my last ½ cup. And I'm doing that because I wanna show you something that's kind of important when it comes to baking. And when you are scooping flour, you never wanna take your measuring cup and put it in the flour container and scoop it without using a spoon, because what'll happen is in a 1 cup measuring cup, you can add as much as 1 to 2 tablespoons of additional flour when you scoop it, because you're packing in all of that flour. So the best way to do it is you want to take your spoon, lightly scoop the flour into your measuring cup. And again, this is a ½ cup now because I'm putting the last ½ cup into my mixture of flour here. And I usually fill it to where it's just slightly overflowing. And then you can take a knife. In my case, I'm using my little wooden spoon here, and then brush off the flour that's in there. And if you've got a little bit of extra space there, you can add a little bit more flour and then just brush it off like that, and you have a nice, smooth, perfect surface. So that's the last of the ½ cup that we're gonna add to our bowl here, and that will ensure that I will only have 5½ cups of flour in here as I want, instead of more or less. So now that we have our 5½ cups of flour, we're going to put it all in the mixing bowl. And I know that sounds kind of odd if you tend to make bread, because we typically don't put all of the flour in at once. It's usually a little at a time, and we check it for thickness. Well, this recipe calls for all at once. So that's what we're gonna do, put it all in at once. So just kind of be careful. You don't want for the flour to spill out. So with this mixture, we're gonna put the flour, which is the entire 5½ cups, and then we're gonna add our 2 teaspoons of salt to that. I have this handy dandy dough hook. Once you put it on your mixer, set it in, lock it up, and on low, let the dough hook mix the flour with the salt, and that just prevents the flour from popping out. So we have the cooled Tangzhong mixture. Remember, it needs to be between 100 and 110 degrees. To be honest with you, if you are delayed and it gets a little too cool, you can always stick it in the microwave for about 20 seconds, and that will warm it up a bit. Just make sure it's no more than 115 degrees. So 100, 110 is ideal. I've cracked 2 eggs. Now the recipe calls for 3, but that 3rd egg, we're gonna wait until right before we put the bread in the oven, and we're gonna brush the top of both loaves with the beaten egg. So here I have 2 beaten eggs. When you crack an egg into a dish, you really want to do 1 egg at a time and put it in a separate bowl. You don't want to eat eggshells while you're eating your bread. So an egg in a separate bowl, mix it up. We're going to add our 2 eggs, cracked and mixed, into the Tangzhong mixture, and then we're just going to slowly stir it so that nothing flies out of this bowl here. Get it ready to add to the dry mixture. So we have our Tangzhong mixture and our egg, our 2 eggs in here. And so take a look at this frothy yeast. So I don't know how well you can see that on camera, but you can see there's a thickness of froth. Right here at the top, there's a layer of it. And then of course, when you look on the inside, you can see how frothy it is. So we're going to slowly add, now that we know for sure that a Tangzhong mixture and egg are at a good temperature, we're gonna slowly add our yeast to this and stir it. And again, we just wanna make sure that we don't have anything that's too hot, because we certainly don't wanna kill the yeast, and we don't want to cook our eggs. Now we're gonna pour this slowly into our dry mixture. So this is all of the wet ingredients. All right, so I'm gonna put the mixture on low. And then as you can see, we're just gonna slowly pour this in. The dough hook is gonna continue to mix, and it's gonna mix everything up. It's gonna just take a few moments, but you don't wanna put it on high, you wanna leave it on low. Again, you don't want anything to pop out of the bowl. So, and if you're doing this by hand, you do the same thing. You're just mixing it all by hand really well until it's a nice shaggy mess. We have our last ingredient to add, and this is 1/4 cup of butter, or 4 tablespoons. I'm just going to add it to our dough mixture here. And it's softened butter. It'll be easier for the machine to work it in if it's soft. So you want to let it sit out for at least probably an hour. Let the mixer mix it up. So the dough is ready. When I raise up the paddle, you can see that it's a sticky dough. It's not too sticky. You want it to be a little shaggy. If it's too wet or too dry, if it's too dry, you want to add some liquid. Just add a little bit of warm water. And if it's too wet, you want to add maybe a tablespoon of flour until it gets to this consistency where it's still hanging on to the dough hook and it's starting to fall off, but it's not too wet. So I actually ended up needing to add about 1/4 cup of warm water because my dough was actually too thick. But depending on where you live, depending on humidity or lack of humidity in my case, you might need to add some more liquid. So just look at your dough as it's kneading and decide, does it look too dry? Does it look too wet? And it's okay to adjust the measurements. Maybe a suggestion I would do is I added all 5½ cups when I started mixing it all together. What I would probably do next time is maybe start with 4½, give myself another extra 1 cup to play with, and then slowly add that extra cup in as it's working, whether it's kneading using the machine or kneading by hand. Now we're ready to hand knead. Take a look at the dough. I want to show you. Notice how it's still sticking to the edge of the bowl, but not too much. It comes off when you easily put your spatula between the dough and the bowl. So this is a good textured dough. That's really what you're looking for when you're deciding whether or not to add liquid or flour to make sure it's the right consistency. So one of my favorite things I discovered recently is kneading on a cutting board. That's right. So what I like to do is I put down a dish towel, and then I have this awesome cutting board that I have been using for kneading. Notice how big it is. It is huge. So it's great to put down on top of the dish towel so it keeps it from moving, and you can knead all day long on this cutting board, and you're not going to slide from one side to the other, and your dough's got plenty of space to move around. We're going to add some flour. You definitely want to flour your board pretty well, because you don't want the dough to stick. And then we're going to basically just scoop our dough out onto the floured surface. So you can get it all out. There's this pretty hefty dough. You could divide this in half, only knead half at a time. So it's pretty much up to you what you choose to do. And then of course you want to flour your hands. And notice how, well, look at this dough, if you can see that. It is such a nice, pretty, fluffy dough. Notice how it just oozes out over either side of my hand. You know you've got a good looking dough here, which means it's gonna rise really quickly and well because it's so light, it's not too dense. So for kneading, what I typically do is you fold it over so you've got a nice little ball, take the palm of your hand and push forward. So the reason why this is a good kneading technique is because as you're pushing forward, you're going to push out the dough that's on the inside in the center, and it's going to allow you to continue to knead that. So basically the inside of the dough is being pushed to the outside of the dough, and then you just continue to knead it until you want to knead about 10 minutes. That should get all of the dough nice and kneaded. And if you can hear it, I don't know if you can, but as you knead, sometimes you'll get these little bubbles that pop as the air is going through the dough. And that's what we're trying to do is with the kneading. We're trying to get, the air in, trying to get the dough that's on the inside on the outside. And you can tell, like, as the inside of the dough is pushing out, it starts to get a little bit wet. And it's because that's the raw dough that you're now kneading. It's no longer the flour on the outside. So you can tell if you look at it, it's becoming a wet dough. It's getting a little bit sticky. When it does that, guess what? Just add a little bit more flour to my cutting board surface here, and you continue to knead. A couple of years ago, my husband and I saw a documentary about Japanese cornbread, and we were like, Japanese cornbread? I'm from the American South, so my grandmother was known for her cornbread. When I heard about the Japanese cornbread, I thought, okay, yeah, I know what cornbread is, That's not what they did. They would use this yeast bread, and this is the yeast bread we're using, is the basis. You can get it at the Shitos airport. That's where this bread is popular. What they did is they use this dough, and then they'll break off pieces of like a roll, and then they put a little hole in the center and they stuff it with corn. And then they cover it back up and they bake it. They call it cornbread, but it's yeasted dough with a nice surprise of whole kerneled corn on the inside. Who would have thought? So on my search is where I found the yeasted dough, and I decided let's do just the actual yeast dough itself. Here's a trick. If you want to know when your dough is ready, okay, look how easy it is for me to knead this right now. I am just pushing it forward. So you turn it over. So basically you're bringing the two sides together. Take the palm of your hand, push forward. You're gonna put a little bit of effort into it. Curve up the sides toward the center. Rotate it around towards you so that you've got this nice little fold to the back, and then you're going to push forward again. And you continue to do that over and over and over until you reach that 10-minute mark. Now there are a couple of ways you can decide when your dough is ready. One of them is called the stained glass technique. So if you take a little bit of your dough, kind of roll it in a ball, and then you start to spread it apart. If you can see through it, where it's starting to separate, but yet you don't have a hole, and actually ours is doing that right now, that's a sign that it's ready. My favorite way of doing it, when I can take the ball and I can press, bounces back, and it looks like a baby's butt. I'm sorry, it's just cute. Now that our dough is ready, it's time for the rise. So one of the things I like to do is get a nice tall, your mixing bowl is fine, a big one, because remember your dough should almost double in size. So you want a container that's going to be large enough for it to fit. And I do like to spray the inside of it. Makes it a little easier to take the dough out. So we've got our nice little round here, our big thick round. We're going to stick it in the bottom of the bowl here. And I'm also going to spray the top because as it rises, and it's going to touch the plastic wrap that I put on top of it, and I don't want it to stick. So the spray helps that. Put some plastic on top and I'm gonna sit it over the stove. So we have our bowl wrapped in plastic. I have my oven turned on at 200 degrees. We're gonna set this on top of the stove, not in the oven, but on top of the stove. Now check this out. The dough has risen and it was actually a little less than an hour. So that's how quickly this dough can rise. Notice, remember we sprayed the top of the dough? Hopefully it won't stick. Notice how it comes right off of the plastic comes right off of the dough. We're going to deflate it. When you put the little spatula in there, notice the little bubbles on the top? Definitely has been rising. There's lots of air built up into this nice dough. So we're going to deflate it and we're going to put it out onto our cutting board, making sure that we have it nicely floured so that the dough does not stick to it. Okay, so we're going to cut this in half. And I always like to put a little bit of flour on my knife. So just eyeball it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Notice how if you use a serrated knife, it just cuts pretty nicely in half. Okay, so we have our two halves here. And now we're gonna cut each half into fourths because we're making 2 loaves of bread. So we're gonna have 2 loaf pans. Each loaf pan is gonna have a half of the dough, but we're gonna cut it into fourths. So what I like to do is cut this one in half now. Okay, and then we can cut this in half. So that gives us 2 of the 4 that we need. And now we have our 4, simple as that. Okay, so this is going to go into 1 loaf pan. And then we'll put those 4 aside. And then this is going to go into the other loaf pan. Now I do have 2 slightly different size loaf pans. It doesn't really matter. As long as you have 2 loaf pans that, you know, one of them is going to rise a little bit more than the other if you have a smaller loaf pan, but it's still going to all be the same as far as the bread's concerned. It's not going to ooze out over the sides or anything. Okay, so now we have 1 loaf pan and the other loaf pan. Let's deal with 1 loaf pan first. Okay, so for each round, we're going to flatten it out to where it's a nice 6-inch in diameter round. Okay, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You can just eyeball it. That should be about right. Okay, that's close to 6 and that's close to 6. So we're in good shape. All right, so once you flatten them out, you're gonna roll it up like a cinnamon roll. So you take one edge, whichever one's closest to you is fine, and you're just gonna roll it up like so. Okay, you're gonna do that for each of these 4. Okay, so again, quick, nice rounds, and then roll them up. They don't have to be perfect. You just go through it quickly. It's totally fine. Because what's going to happen is once you put them in the loaf pans, they're just going to rise anyway. So the point is just to get them pretty equal. And it's okay when you smush them in the loaf pan because it's going to create this nice, thick, fluffy loaf of bread. It's going to look beautiful. All right, so there you go. And we're going to do the same with the other 4. So now we have each loaf pan sprayed and ready to go. Remember when I told you I had 2 different size loaf pans? One's just a tad bit smaller than the other. It's okay. You know what? It's not going to be a big deal. It's going to rise above the pan anyway, the top, so it doesn't really matter. With the rolled up cinnamon roll style loaves that you have, you're just going to place them in your greased pan, one right next to the other, and you can squeeze them in there. It's going to be one tight space here, but it's okay. Notice how they're nice and squeezed in, and you can see the little rolls from the edges, kind of like the little cinnamon roll, and once it bakes, you're really going to notice it. Okay, so that's 1 pan. So let's get the second one in pretty quickly. Just shove them all in there. It's pretty simple. And same thing, you can definitely tell this is a smaller pan because they look a little bit more scrunched in there than the other, but we're ready to go. We're gonna cover back with plastic wrap and spray the plastic wrap so the individual dough is gonna rise and you don't want to stick to the plastic again. Sit it back on your stove. Again, remember I keep my stove at 200 degrees and I keep them on top of the stove for about 45 minutes to an hour it'll take to rise, and honestly, because your house is pretty warm over there in that area, it's probably not even gonna take 45 minutes. And set your temperature of the oven to 350 degrees about 15 minutes prior to the end of the rise, and then go about your day and do something fun. Go for a walk, vacuum your house, answer a bunch of emails, your choice. The second rise is complete. So this is the little bit smaller loaf, and it did rise a tad bit more than this one, but this one also had more space to expand on the sides. And I'm really glad I added a little bit of space with the plastic on top because the bread is clearly higher than the pan now. The last thing we're gonna do is use that 3rd egg that was in the recipe. Remember, we only used 2 for the actual dough. So this 3rd egg is to be cracked. You're gonna whisk it up, and then we're simply just gonna rub it over the top. Once it's in the oven and it starts to bake, this egg wash is gonna produce a very nice, dark, shiny loaf once it's cooked. We're just gonna stick these in the oven. We're gonna let them cook for about 30 minutes. But at the 15-minute mark, we're gonna pull them out and we're gonna just tint a little bit of foil and put it on top, and this will prevent the dough from over browning. Egg wash is on both of these, and now they're ready to go in the oven. You can see it's just on the top. Here's the big reveal. Ta-da! They just came out of the oven. So I did wait till 20 minutes before I put the foil on. And when I made these the last time, they were done in 30 minutes, but I have a different oven now, so it took about 35 for me to feel confident in taking them out. You know, one of the reasons I like to use a glass pan, you can actually see how brown on the bottom and on the side these are. Notice the little swirls in the middle of each of those 4 rolls. Beautiful bread. So we need to let them sit out for about an hour and let them cool. And then they'll be ready to remove from the pans and slice. So it looks like our bread's finally cooled. So let's see if they'll come out easily enough without having to put a knife through the edges. Okay, this one came out really easily. Okay, you can see, just look at the bottom of that. Nice little sides, beautiful top. You can see that egg wash, how it made it really shiny. All right, now this one, yeah, this one's a little bit stuck, and you can tell just by pulling it. If you pull on the bread and try to pull it away from the pan, you can tell if there's any edges that are a little bit stuck. So I'm just gonna run my knife through the edge. The rest of this looks pretty okay. So we'll see what happens. Turn it over and there it comes. Okay, pretty good. All right, so what I like to do with these is you can leave them like this, you can slice them. I tend to like to slice mine and then put them in the freezer until you're ready to eat them, and they'll last a long time in the freezer. So cut them out, slice them up. I love to eat these as sandwich bread, or you can have it for a snack in the afternoon with some Nutella. That's pretty cool too. All right, let's cut into it and let's see what we have. Okay, it's cutting nice and smoothly. Wow, take a look at the inside of that. Very consistent in texture from the top to the bottom and the sides. Let's do another cut along this line here. It's a big slice, but it's okay. We want to see what it looks like. So notice the crumb here. I'm going to tear this apart so you can see how it just breaks apart. Notice the crumb. It's got that little bit of texture to it. It definitely has that stretchiness to it, which is what you want. And then when you press down on it, it bounces back. That tells you that the bread is done and that we didn't undercook it. You can definitely smell the yeast. I can smell the richness from the butter and the milk, and you can definitely get a hint of that sweetness. Now you're gonna find it strange, but I honestly cannot taste this bread. I developed gluten sensitivity. I am learning a lot about gluten-free, and I still love to bake. I have eaten this bread, so I can tell you exactly what it tastes like, but this bread really reminds me of a French brioche. And if you're not familiar with the brioche, it's a buttery, sweet, light, fluffy bread that really melts in your mouth, and it's typically eaten at breakfast or like a snack, and that's a lot like this bread. Thanks for watching. Please leave any comments or questions down below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and please share my video with your family and friends and anyone you know who likes to bake, even if you don't like them. Thank you again, and go bake the world.